Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Student Pilot Cast, Episode 2, Where to Spend Your Kids' College Fund, or How to Decide on a Flight School and CFI. Today we'll be talking about how I chose my flight school and what criteria I used and thought was important.
Chandler Ground, Cherokee 4121 Tango, Chandler Air Service taxi for south departure Kilo.
Where does the sun go when it sleeps?
Okay, I guess today I want to start off by explaining why there's been a slight delay since my last episode. I got delayed in actually starting my lessons, and I'll explain why here. It dovetails nicely into the topic today, which is choosing your flight school. So like I said before, I have chosen to use Chandler Air Service for my flight school. It's also an FBO located at Chandler Municipal Airport in Chandler, Arizona. And I chose them based on various criteria, which I'm going to talk about today. But as a result of that, it turns out that they've been extremely busy with flight training, and it was very, very difficult for me to get started. They've assured me that they are graduating, if you will, many of their students over the last week and over the coming weeks. And so I actually have my first real lesson set up for tomorrow. So before I got started with that, and before I got too deep into the training, which of course I will keep everybody abreast of, I wanted to talk about the criteria that I used to choose a flight school. I'd love to get feedback on this and find out what other people think is important, but I'm just going to talk today about the things that I believe were important. So I have had a little setback as far as getting my training started, but I guess about a week and a half or so. But I am getting started tomorrow, and it looks like scheduling is getting much, much easier, and so I think I will hopefully be able to meet my goal of flying or having a lesson 3 times a week. So, in the meantime, since I had a week and a half or so before I started, I went ahead and went and got my medical, and I'm actually going to do an episode on this at some future time. I mean, it's no big deal, but I'm sure that people doing this for the first time could use a little bit of advice and a little bit more information about what it's all about. Okay, so let's get started on today's topic: how to choose a flight school or a CFI. Well, this is a pretty big topic, and it is discussed ad nauseum, I think, in a lot of the forums and other places. But I just wanted to talk about today how I did it and what criteria I used. I broke it down basically into 4 different areas, or 4 plus 1, actually, and I'll talk about that plus 1 at the end. But, I think there's a lot of determining factors in choosing a CFI or a flight school, or, how you want to get trained. I'm lucky. I live in Arizona. We have lots of good flying days and lots of flight schools that go along with lots of those flying days. And we have lots of different types of flight schools as well. And I'm going to talk about that and talk about those different types as we go throughout the podcast today. The first criteria I used was convenience. I think this is really important for most everybody. And convenience means a couple of different things. I think first and foremost, it's, how convenient is it to get to the airport? How close is it to home or work? And where will you be when you go to your lessons, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think one thing that's overlooked sometimes about the convenience factor is the scheduling. That's a big part of the convenience criteria, in my opinion. And it's something that I've already bumped up against a little bit after my choice. I believe that there's a lot of criteria that goes into, how good the scheduling is going to be for each individual. First and foremost is, when do they do flight training? I don't know if this is true, but I suppose there's some FBOs that maybe aren't open on weekends, or maybe only open one day on the weekend. And if that's when you really need to do your training, it's going to be difficult for you. The same thing might be true for some of the more pro-oriented flight schools. They may not do a lot of training on the weekends. And if you're somebody like me who, has a regular job to finance our flight training, weekends can be a very convenient time to do this. But scheduling, as I've found out, also has to do with how busy they are, how many instructors they have. Are they short instructors because, they're moving to regional airlines, et cetera, et cetera. And, that's something that you want to keep in mind, and something that I actually asked as I interviewed different flight schools. What's the process for scheduling? How difficult is it? How behind are you? How busy are you, etc.? I also talked about the times that I would like to fly and tried to get an idea of whether that was going to be feasible or not. So as far as scheduling, I'll just tell you, what was important to me. I wanted to make sure that I could get a flight in or a lesson in the late afternoon. So, on maybe one day a week where I could, come in after my meetings at work or after work and do a lesson one weekday night. It was also important for me to be able to schedule an early morning flight before work. And it turns out that Chandler Air Service was pretty easy to do either one of those. They have a later in the afternoon, early evening time slot, as well as an early morning time slot. And of course, with this particular FBO and flight school, they also train extensively on weekends, which is going to be very helpful for me in particular. So let's move on to the next criteria, and that is the training philosophy. This is a much bigger topic. There's delineations between schools, between Part 141 or Part 61 schools. There's, how much emphasis they put on decision-making, if that's important to you, whether they do formal phase checks where you go with another instructor or maybe one of the chief instructors, and also what type of school it is. So there's some schools that, really cater to the, pro or future pro pilot. Then there's schools that are more of an FBO at a general aviation airport. And still, again, there's independent CFIs that would, of course, teach under Part 61. And, all of these have benefits and drawbacks, and you have to kind of weigh what those are. So let me talk about what was important to me. Like I said before, I'm pretty lucky to live in Arizona, where there's lots of different flight schools, lots of good days to fly. And some of these schools we have here in Arizona, I think it's similar in Florida. Some of these schools are really, really aimed at the pro or future pro pilot. Some people call these places pilot factories. It sounds a little negative to me, so I'll try not to use that term. But this is an option even for people like me who don't intend to go pro, if you will. But I chose the FBO route because of several things. First and foremost, I don't do epaulets. So let me explain. If you don't know what epaulets are, it's those crazy little bars that pro pilots sometimes wear on their white shirts over their shoulders. I don't know if these pro schools require that, but you always see in their brochures and in their on their websites all these students walking around with these white pilot shirts and epaulets on their shoulders. No, thank you. But kidding aside, I think there is a difference in the philosophy that these schools use. And while my logic could be flawed, I definitely don't claim to know everything. But in my gut, I felt like I wanted sort of the more personal, maybe less structured approach to the training. I wanted to fly on weekends. Some of these, schools don't do a lot of flying on weekends. And essentially, I just wanted to have sort of the more general aviation feel to my training. And so for that reason, at a really high level, I chose to, I wanted to go either the independent CFI route or the FBO route, and not one of these, pro pilot schools, if you will. So that's something that you can kind of figure out what's best for you. As far as Part 141 or 61, while I just said that I kind of wanted the less structured approach, I do want a structured curriculum. And that sort of led me toward the Part 141 schools, which are required by the FAA to have a structured curriculum, phase checks, where you're at in the process and so on. But when it comes right down to it, it doesn't really matter whether you're trained Part 141 or 61, as I've done more research, especially when you're doing primary training, except for the difference of 5 hours that are required, which almost never comes into play, as anybody who's starting research about doing pilot training knows, it usually takes longer than the minimum 40 or under Part 141 minimum 35 hours that are required by the FAA to get your private pilot license. So it's probably not going to be a factor, those 5 hours difference in requirements. So as far as whether I'm actually doing Part 141 or Part 61, I don't think that mattered as much to me. But I did want the Part 141 type of curriculum and structure. So it turns out that Chandler Air Service, while they are a Part 141 school, they sometimes teach under Part 61 and they sometimes teach under Part 141. I to tell you the truth, I don't actually know which one I'm going to be doing. I'm sure that's just up to me and my instructor. But whether they're doing Part 61 or Part 141, they assured me that they do the same phase checks, they follow the same curriculum, etc. And so that part was most important to me. So whether it's actually under Part 141 or 61 is less important for me personally. One other thing that I happen to like about the school that I chose is that they're a training school for aerobatics, and I don't necessarily want to go straight into aerobatic training, but they have several tailwheel airplanes, and one of the things that the instructor that I was talking to initially when I was sort of asking questions and interviewing them, if you will, one of the things that he said that sort of pleased me was that he said, when you finish your primary training, you may as well get a tailwheel endorsement. And that was something that I was planning on doing anyway. And for them to come out and say, you might as well do that. We have the ability and so on. That sort of made me feel good about, about the type of philosophy that they have around training. Okay, so now moving on to criteria 3. And that is equipment. So what equipment will you be training with? And that's not limited just to the airplanes that you may be training in, but that's probably the biggest component. But also, are they going to use any simulators that they may have? That may come into play more for instrument training, but, find out what type of equipment each school or each CFI is going to use. Now, when you're talking about equipment for training, it's generally going to mean the airplanes that you're going to be using. And it goes beyond just whether they have nice planes or whether their planes are well kept inside or whether they're kind of run down, et cetera, et cetera. The planes that you use, I believe, are going to have a large effect on your training and the training environment and so on. So the first and most obvious is, are they well kept? This is going to be very difficult for a prospective student to know other than, what do they look like, right? And I really, really recommend that when you narrow down your flight schools to, a handful, that you go and talk to these guys. And one of the things you should do while you're talking to them is ask to look at their airplanes that you would be training in. I haven't had one say that you couldn't do that yet. And I think it's a good idea to do that. Even an untrained eye can tell if something's really, really run down. Now, also don't expect most training airplanes to be shiny, glossy, brand new, 2008s either. Although you can find those, but we're going to get to whether I think that's such a great idea in just a few minutes. So, one of the other first and most obvious differentiators between training aircraft is the age-old high-wing versus low-wing debate. And from everybody that I've talked to, there is a real difference in the way those two designs fly in practice. I don't have enough personal experience with it yet. I have actually flown both types now. So if you listen to my earlier episode 1, you'll remember that I actually did do a little bit of training a long, long time ago, and that was in Cessna high-wing trainers. And I took the introductory flight with Chandler Air Service just recently, and that was in a Piper Warrior, a low wing. So I have had a tiny bit of experience in both types of airplanes, but definitely not enough to understand the differences myself. But everybody that I've talked to, both in person and online or read about, there really is a difference in the way these things fly. Not one not being necessarily better than the other. People surely develop personal preferences, but there is a difference. Now, I think that it's less important in in what we use as a trainer, high wing versus low wing, than some of the other criteria we're going to talk about in a moment. But it is, a consideration. That being said, I always expected to be training in a high-wing aircraft. That's what I had done before, and the flight schools that I was familiar with, that's what they used for the most part. But it turns out after, going through the different criteria that I had for a flight school, I ended up choosing a school that primarily uses low-wing Piper trainers. So it surprised me a little bit, but that is the direction that I decided to go. But I'm excited about it. I think that these Piper Warriors are going to be great trainers, as would a high-wing aircraft. Now, one of the schools that I did interview, I went and talked to, great guys. They met all of the other criteria that I had. But they were using equipment that was very, very, very nice. They train mostly in fairly new Cirrus SR-20s. They even have SR-22s, but they don't generally do primary training in those for obvious reasons. But they have very nice, Avidyne glass cockpit SR-20s, and they train mostly in those. Beautiful, beautiful airplane. I went and looked at it, sat down in it, very impressed with these airplanes. But one of the things I knew early on is that I didn't want to train in a glass cockpit airplane. And the reason for that, personally, is that I sort of want to have a classic experience with my training. And glass cockpits are anything but classic piloting, right? I think that there's nothing wrong with glass cockpits. I expect at some future time that I'll probably be flying mostly glass cockpit airplanes. But I think that's down the road a ways, and I really wanted to learn using steam gauges. And the other consideration there is that these newer, nicer airplanes, not necessarily the glass cockpit airplanes, but the newer, nicer airplanes tend to be a little higher performance. And what that means to a student is you have less decision time. Or if it's a complex airplane, so, retractable landing gear, constant speed prop, that sort of thing. Again, what that means to a student is you have more task loading. You have more things to worry about as you're learning a lot of things at one time. So I wanted to stay away from the high performance. I wanted to stay away from the complex as a trainer. And I wanted to stay away from the glass cockpit. And the last consideration there is the cost. If you're going to be training in one of these nicer, newer airplanes, it's going to cost you. So while I was at this school, I really liked the people, I liked their training philosophy, it would have been staggeringly more expensive for me to train in an airplane that I really didn't think I was ready to fly anyway, or didn't really want to use as a trainer to get this classic type of training that I was hoping to get. So I sort of ruled them out, and I ruled out other FBOs or other schools that tended to use, higher end airplanes, if you will, not the standard trainers. So the equipment that you're going to use in your training is definitely a big criteria and something that you need to think about and consider. And the fourth criteria that I thought about, and of course is the big elephant in the room, and that is cost. And we've already talked about that a little bit. As a matter of fact, all of these criteria are really intertwined in a lot of ways. But cost is a major decision point, but I think it's one of the easier ones. First of all, how much can I afford? It's really easy, right? The second question I would ask about affordability or cost is, if I pay more for one school than another, what am I getting? What is the value or the perceived value that I'm going to get out of that? The prices on these different schools were very diverse, very, very wide gap between the most affordable and the most expensive. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. Sometimes it's equipment. Sometimes it's a higher price for the dual time or the CFI time, etc. But the way I looked at it is, if I'm paying a higher price for fancy equipment, fancy airplanes, I don't think that's worth it for me. But if I'm paying a higher cost, and that higher cost is the CFI portion, or the dual training, the dual portion of the training, then there may be a reason to pay that extra cost, and that is if you believe that you are going to get a better instructor, or you're going to get better instruction, more efficient instruction, paying that higher cost is well worth it. And it's the same for everything in life, right? A lot of times we pay extra for better service, or we pay extra for better quality. And if you're paying extra for the CFI time, it's possible that you're going to get, in general, more quality instruction. Now, that's not always going to be the case, and so you have to look at all of these other criteria and figure out if you think you're right on that. But economics do play a role here, and if anybody's had any formal economics training, or heaven forbid you have a hobby of studying economics. I actually majored in economics for quite a while in school. But there's this idea of economics on the supply side or on the employment side that says if there is an FBO or a flight school that is paying their instructors more, they're going to have a better selection of people to hire. Now, just because you're paying the school more for the CFI doesn't necessarily mean that CFI is getting paid more than somewhere else. Maybe the owners are pocketing it all. I don't know. Maybe they have a high cost of rent or something. But all other things being equal, if they're charging you more for the CFI, there's a good chance that the CFI is actually getting paid maybe more than they would somewhere else. And if that's the case, then the laws of economics basically determine the fact that they are going to have a better selection of people to choose from. And if you have a better selection or a bigger selection of people to choose from, you're going to tend to get better quality. And that's why it's one of the small factors that I would definitely include there, and it's something that you may want to consider spending more money on. Again, I caveat this with that's not always going to be true, but in general, it probably is. And so I was okay going to a school that tends to pay a little more, or charge a little more, I should say, for the dual time. And it turns out that Chandler Air Service does charge a little more than some of the others for the dual time, but they charge, in some cases, quite a bit less for the equipment. And that was exactly along the lines of the type of breakdown that I was interested in. To add on top of that, when I did do the inspections at the different flight schools that I was interested in, I thought that the place that I chose had actually very, very nice equipment. I mean, it's not, they're not using new glass panels and they're not using brand new aircraft, but that was part of my criteria that I didn't want to happen. They're using fairly late model 70s vintage Piper Warriors for the most part, and they're very well kept. They look like they're in good condition. And so it fit the bill perfectly for me. The other thing to consider about cost is most schools and most FBOs and rental places, for that matter, will give you what are called block discounts. So if you pay a larger block of money, sort of put it on an account, if you will, and then pull out of that account, a lot of times they'll give you a discount on the rental fees. One thing to keep in mind here is you don't want that block necessarily to be too gigantic. I've talked to several people that have done that with flight schools before, where especially the pro-oriented schools, where they will, they'll take $40,000 up front and then in a year go out of business when you're halfway through your training. And of course you don't see much of that money ever come back to you. The same thing can happen to an FBO or a smaller school at a general aviation airport. It's a tough business. Fuel prices are going up, and, FBOs, even ones that have been around for quite a long time, may go out of business. So consider, if somebody wants a $5,000 block, it might be a little high. But the other thing to consider is if they do ask for a $1,000 block to get the discount, and that sounds reasonable to me, but don't go buy, $5,000 worth necessarily, because a lot of things can happen. You could decide, you need to put your training on hold because of a job change or something like that. Well, you don't want to be out all of that money. So think about that when you're doing it. But if you've got the money to do it, which hopefully you would if you're going to start training, go ahead and take advantage of those discounts. Now, the 1+1 criteria that I talked about before, the way I look at it is how you click with the people at the school and how you click with the CFI and so on. Now, this is going to be something that's pretty difficult to determine until you start your training, but you can get an idea for it when when you're talking to people. So all of these criteria are a real balance. If you're really, really lucky, you might get everything you want, but like everything in life, there's usually trade-offs involved and compromise. So the first thing I would do is figure out, and the first thing I did is figure out your absolute needs, budget, convenience factors, etc. You know, you don't want to necessarily drive 3 hours to get to the airport if there's 3, that are within a half an hour. So figure out, what the absolute needs are and narrow it down to a few schools. Once you've got your narrowed down choices, it's not nearly as overwhelming. From there, you can, start going through some of the other criteria and determine what are your priorities. And then start talking to them. Go out and visit them. Get an idea of what they're like. Ask to see the trainer aircraft that you'd be using. Talk to a CFI. Ask about scheduling. All those things that make a difference in what your experience is going to be like. It can be a little bit intimidating, A lot of things when you're getting into something new for the first time and you don't really understand everything, it can be a little intimidating to just, walk into an FBO or walk into a school and start asking questions. But it's important that you get over that if it is intimidating, because you're going to be spending a lot of money and you're in charge. You're the boss, so to speak. So figure out who you want to hire, because that's really what you're doing. And you need to know more than just prices and so on when you're making that choice. So when I put this all together and made a decision on mine, I actually narrowed it down to 2 different locations, or 2 different general aviation airports. There's Falcon Field, which is in Mesa, Arizona, and there's Chandler Municipal Airport, which is in Chandler, Arizona. And they're almost exactly the same driving distance from my house, or driving time, that is, from my house, about 15, 20 minutes. So I could go to either one, and it would be about the same. So once I narrowed it down to those 2 locations, I found out, what all the schools were and what all the FBOs were that teach at each one of those airports, and started going through my other criteria. What's most important to me? What are their prices? What equipment, etc. And once I narrowed it down to about 4 different schools, 3 or 4 different schools, I went out and visited them and sat down with a CFI or a representative and talk to them about what their philosophies are and asked them about all these other criteria that we've talked about today. They showed me the airplanes that they use, and I just generally got a feel for what they were going to be like. In 2 of those 4 that I visited, I never actually got to speak to a CFI. And the reason for that is that they either weren't there or that they were all up and very busy, and that I might be able to come back at another time and so on. And at one of them in particular, they just came right out and said, look, we're really shorthanded right now. And, we've had a lot of people leave for the airlines, and we don't have a lot of CFIs. We're short right now. And that doesn't bode well for the whole scheduling thing. So that helped to take that one off my list. They also didn't have very many aircraft at that one, although it seemed to be a really nicely run, top-notch facility. They do a lot of things, an FBO, and they do a lot of different things. Training is one of them, but it just didn't seem like a good time to use that school. Another one I went to, I also wasn't able to ever talk to a CFI. They were always busy, but I enjoyed talking to the representative that I talked to. She showed me all of their planes. She went over all of their philosophies and so on. Felt comfortable with them. It was interesting, though, that their planes were very, very old. And it wasn't just that they were old, but they were really sad looking. And they knew it. They said, look, they're not much to look at, but they are safe, and we maintain them well, and they're trainers, and so we don't worry too much about the way they look, which is fine. But it was a little difficult to get over some of the wear and tear on these airplanes. And all other things being equal, I'd rather be in a slightly more well-kept airplane. Of course, all other things are not always equal, so you have to take that into consideration. And I definitely did consider this school, and in my mind, they made the cut when I cut it down to 2 schools before I decided to go with Chandler for all the reasons that we talked about. So that's my story, and I used a lot of references when I was doing this. Obviously, I am not an expert. This is the first time that I've really gotten this serious and done this, but I just used the resources that I was able to find. I got some really good information from CFI Cast, which I believe you can find at pilotcast.com. I also got really, really good information from Jason Miller over at The Finer Points, which you can find at thefinerpoints.net. I also read some of the forums, AOPA forum in particular, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. when it came right down to it, I just kind of had to use common sense and find out what felt right to me. So that's how I did it, and that's the criteria that I used. And hopefully some of this will be helpful to somebody else out there, but most importantly, I would love to hear feedback. What was important to you, how you made the decision, or how you're making the decision, and so on. So please visit thestudentpilotcast.com, and under the show notes for this episode, please leave feedback, or you can send feedback directly to me at that same website on the contact page. And if I get a lot of good information in that feedback, I'll make sure to do an update in a future episode to make sure that information gets out on this audio cast. So I think that should do it for now. Thanks for listening. And until next time, remember, life is good. I'm going to be a pilot.
I know I should by now. It isn't written in my stars. Shadows, dreams, at night and dark. That sometimes seem just as far. I know so many things by now. I feel that never come to pass. Just childhood dreams of random things that stay always so fast. So what does it take to be an angel? Or does it matter much at all?
The music for today's audio cast is the song To Be an Angel from the great Canadian band Uncle Seth. You can get more information and subscribe to the Student Pilot Audiocast using iTunes, Zune, or any other podcatcher at www.studentpilotcast.com.